Diplomatic Channel is front and center with the attacks on foreigners and foreign-owned businesses in South Africa, the response by the Nigerian government, and what should be done.
On Saturday, Zimbabwe declared Robert Mugabe a national hero. President Emmerson Mnangagwa said the country will be in national mourning of his death until the former leader is buried.
The late departed icon will be eternally remembered and honored for the bold and historic land reform program which he undertook. Through this program, indigenous Zimbabweans regained their long-denied land rights to complete their sovereignty. For that, he was especially vilified, shunned, and punished by those who stood to lose from an end to colonial rights and from a just reassession of African rights.
Mugabe, the Bourgeois guerrilla who led Zimbabwe to independence and crushed his foes during nearly 4 decades of rule, had been receiving medical treatment in Singapore before kicking the bucket on Friday. He was one of the most polarizing figures in Africa's history, a giant of African liberation whose rule finally ended when he was overthrown by his own army. US President Donald Trump has called off peace negotiations with the Taliban that sought to end America's 18-year war in Afghanistan. Mr. Trump tweeted he had been set to meet Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and senior Taliban leaders on Sunday, but he cancelled the secret meeting at his Camp David retreat after the militants admitted they were behind a recent attack that killed an American soldier. The talks were due to take place a few days before the anniversary of 9/11. In a swift reaction, the Afghan government urged the Taliban to stop the violence.
What the president has said, the president of the United States in his tweet, he has called off, so there's no talks right now. We strongly believe that what he has said reflects the concerns that were raised, not only in Afghanistan, in Afghan capital, but also in Washington, D.C. as well.
Afghan residents also and a former defense deputy minister have also expressed concern, warning that President Trump's decision will intensify the war in the country.
I think this talk is it's called off, it's not cancelled. It will be resumed at some point, but not anytime soon. I also think that the fighting and the violence and the bloodshed will intensify.
The surprise announcement leaves in doubt the future of the draft accord worked out by the special U.S. envoy for peace in Afghanistan for a drawdown of thousands of U.S. troops over the coming months. Thousands of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong are appealing to President Donald Trump for help as they marched near the U.S. Consulate General in the city on Sunday. Some are carrying banners reading, "President Trump, please save Hong Kong and make Hong Kong great again." The protests, now in their 14th straight week, have continued despite Hong Kong's leadership finally meeting one of the protesters' key demands. China has consistently warned other countries not to interfere. It says the situation in Hong Kong, a former British colony handed back to China in 1997, is purely its own internal affair. Sunday's crowd waved U.S. flags and chanted pleas for the U.S. to liberate Hong Kong from China.
I am Amarachi Ubani, welcoming you to the program. It's been a roller coaster week of attacks and reprisals between hoodlums in South Africa and their counterparts in Nigeria and other parts of Africa. Many have asked if a country whose independence Nigeria and others sacrificed for ought to treat citizens of fellow African countries with such hostility. It's not the first time we've seen these attacks, and unfortunately, it may not be the last. depending on how Nigeria and her neighbors handle the issue. As for Nigeria, the special envoy sent by President Muhammadu Buhari, Ambassador Ahmed Abubakar, is expected to brief the president on the outcome of his meetings with South African authorities alongside the Nigerian High Commissioner to South Africa, Ambassador Kabiru Bala. No, the High Commissioner has not been recalled. It's a process, and all other options have been exhausted. Plus, recalling an ambassador would mean that Nigeria is cutting off ties with South Africa, which at this moment, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jeffrey Onyama, says is not necessary.
We're not reaching to the stage of diplomatic ties called off. There are various options. We're not by any means at the stage where we're breaking diplomatic relations with South Africa. We know for a fact that no Nigerian life has been lost, so we're extremely concerned now to ensure that there will be adequate compensation for the property that has been lost and damaged.
The response by the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the early days of the attacks is perhaps the first time we've heard him speak so sternly on an issue.
No, it's one of the options that we're considering. He will need to come back, but we feel that he should come back after the envoy has gone there, precisely for the reasons that you have mentioned there. So that Mr. President will also have the benefit of a full and comprehensive brief from all the individuals who are in a position to have seen things at a close range.
Sadly, as Nigeria tries to find solutions to what has turned out to be a diplomatic row with Africa's second largest economy, hate speech and the promise of more violence in the coming weeks continue. If we respond violence with violence, we're no better than the people who started the problem in the first place. It won't be the first time we've spoken about xenophobic attacks and hatred for other Africans in South Africa, especially Nigerians. But it is important to stress again that South African workers resent those from other African countries because they think they're taking their jobs away from them, marrying their women, and allegedly infiltrating their society with drugs and crime. Not much will change until the economy improves for them. Time magazine says the country tends to provide better economic opportunities for foreigners than they tend to have in their home countries, and that GDP growth continues to be outstripped by population growth rate, which translates into a real decline of GDP per capita. Plus, that the unemployment is at the highest in a decade, far higher among the youth population, combined with inequality rates that are the highest in the world. Some politicians are drawing attention away from their incompetencies to incite xenophobia. But according to a researcher at the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, Jean-Pierre Misago, anger against foreigners in South Africa dates back decades. Because of the oppressive restrictions of apartheid, Black people were forced to live in poor areas known as townships. When immigrants arrived and looked for business opportunities, they often found that these same townships were the only places they could afford to open shops. Angry and resentful about this, the poor South Africans accused the immigrants of taking their businesses and breeding competition for the scarce jobs and scarce resources. Even back then, political leaders were unable to deliver on services and jobs for their constituents and further stirred these hateful feelings by blaming the immigrants amongst them. They blamed the immigrants of using up medication at the hospitals and of taking advantage of social services. Today, with about 3.6 million foreign nationals within its borders, which make up about 70% of its population, mainly from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho, the blame game continues. Only this time, the attacks have become more violent, the hate speech unchecked, leaving no room for remorse. Should South Africa be given a pass for the impact of apartheid on generations, or should it begin to take responsibility for its own future? Thankfully, according to Mr. Jeffrey Onyama, no Nigerian lives were lost in the most recent attacks, but what will happen next time? Our former permanent secretary at the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi, joins me now from Abuja with some perspective on what should be done. Ambassador, thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you very much.
Let's begin with your initial thoughts of the attacks on foreigners and foreign-owned businesses in South Africa.
Well, the attack itself didn't come as much of a surprise because this is not the first time such attacks are taking place. But I think the positive development, in my view, from the recent incident was the fact that it came with an unusual reaction, not only from the continent itself, but globally. The second point is that for the first time, too, you can see that the South African authorities, at least, the president called an emergency meeting from some reports. So for the first time, the reaction from the people of the continent and the reaction from the South African authorities is a clear indication that finally enough is enough and something might be done to prevent further incidents from happening.
I want us to look at Nigeria's response to the attacks. I mean, apart from the protests, the violent protests that eventually erupted, but from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, do you see a true reflection, I mean, the response, you see it as a true reflection of our position in Africa and the international community, and are they appropriate in this regard?
Yes, I think for now, it's appropriate, it's measured to start with. Sending an envoy, it's the right thing to do in the first instance, because you see, when you begin to hear some news stories that some of the pictures that were being circulated were actually fake. There was a picture, for example, of a building in Mumbai, India, or somewhere that was taken and reflected to be from South Africa. So the first thing first was to really get a good information and account of what exactly was going on in South Africa. And sending an envoy was the right thing to do to get to get all the information, both from the South African side and of course from the Nigerian High Commissioner and from Nigerians in South Africa. The second thing was that, yes, boycotting the World Economic Summit by some leaders was also appropriate in my view. And I think that sends a very clear and ambiguous signal or message to the South African authorities that, look, Africans have had enough of these killings. And the time has come for the South African authorities to take measures to rope in the miscreants that are responsible for these attacks.
I'm sure there were some people are actually expecting that there will be, a more stern approach to what has gone on, because this is not the first time that these attacks have happened, especially against Nigerians and dark-skinned Africans in South Africa.
No, I've read so many comments, like that. But, when things like this happen, you have to put in your rationality cap. You got to be rational and make sure that you are not, emotion does not dictate your reaction. And secondly, again, for those who are saying we need to do this and that, for example, there was this irresponsible comment by, I think, some leaders that we should nationalize South African, businesses in Nigeria, Just the publication about some hardliners on the oil situation, given this 9-point-something, 9-point-something issue, created ripples within the oil market itself. And so when you begin to make such statements, when you are not too sure as to what is happening, you need all the information. When you get the information, you now begin to decide on the lines of action to take. Because at the end of the day, when you take irrational action, like some of the ones you've seen, people demonstrating and destroying their businesses, it also affects us to start with. I just read this morning in some papers that for the demonstrations in Lagos, about 5,000 jobs, will be affected. And for those who were killed, they were not South Africans, they were Nigerians. So this is why we need to be very rational in the decisions we take. I'm not saying that there are nothing else we can do. Of course, there are something else we can do. But the first thing first is get all the facts, engage the South Africans diplomatically, mobilize the rest of the continent to begin to deal with the issue. And I'm sure we'll succeed along the way.
Information is flying in from everywhere, especially in Nigeria. The information is going out on government response. You have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs information that's putting word out there about the Nigerian High Commissioner being recalled. You have the House of Representatives who want to carry out their investigations, and they're willing to back calls for compensation of those who've lost property. What really should be the procedure as regards communication about what has happened and further actions on the issue?
No, I just think that people should allow the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to deal with the situation. And so far, I think that they are doing reasonably well, given the fact, again, like I said, look, the way the ministry works, people should try to understand. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its minister will certainly not respond to newspaper reports. And certainly nobody in government responds to newspaper reports. They want the first-hand information before they react. So sometimes when the ministry is a little bit slow in reacting immediately to events as a result of radio, television, and newspaper reports, is because it's waiting for its envoys on the ground to report to the ministry. And that eventually will form part of the course of action that will be taken. That's not to say that the ministry can work faster, given the speed with which events occur and the technology at our hands these days. But the point is that, look, it creates confusion, as we had when even a minister had to go on air, a press release to say that Nigeria has recalled its high commissioner when Nigeria has not recalled its high commissioner. So the best I can advise is that let everybody calm down, leave this issue to be dealt with by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the presidency. For now, I don't think the National Assembly has anything to do. If they want to conduct a probe, what are they going to do? I hope they won't be thinking of traveling to South Africa, because it doesn't really make sense. For now, I think the presidency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are, in a very reasonable, in my view, handling the matter seriously. But the point must be made to the South African authorities, not just by this country, but by all the countries affected in the continent, that enough is enough, and they must find a once and for all solution to these killings.
We'll take a short break. Our conversation with Ambassador Joe Keshi continues in a moment. Welcome back. Let's continue our conversation with Ambassador Joe Keshi. Ambassador, is this an indication, what's going on and the response to us, is it an indication that we need to rethink our foreign policy as a country?
No, you don't rethink your foreign policy simply because of an incident in another country. Your foreign policy is based on a set of principles, and again, which it's a collection of your national interest. And so once you have defined your national interests, which of course include the protection of your citizens outside your own shores, which is one area of one of the principles of your foreign policy, but you just don't change your foreign policy simply because of one incident in another country. But having said that, yes, in some sense, we have to take a second look at our foreign policy based on the fact that the initial principles, cardinal principles that guided the foreign policy since independence to date, in a way, we probably have achieved most of those things, the decolonization, the end of apartheid, and the rest of it. But maybe now the goal is to focus on, using some principles, our foreign policy, to begin to think of how we can integrate our foreign policy to national development and focus on a number of issues at home. So in that way, you might be right, but you don't change your foreign policy based on a single incident outside your own shores.
Although there have been several incidents of xenophobic attacks in South Africa, but let's move on. It is common knowledge, though, the Black South Africans had a difficult past from which stems all of the hatred and the violence that we've been witnessing over the years. When is it time for them to say enough is enough, we're taking responsibility for this?
Amarachi, you are right in what you have said. Maybe again, it goes back to what I said initially, that for the first time, not just global reaction or continental reaction, the South Africans themselves, quite a number of them are shocked, and some of the leaders, business leaders, have spoken out against these attacks. But what we need to realize is that it's also an admission of this failure of successive ANC government over the years since South Africa became free and independent, that they have failed actually to address some of the critical issues affecting the black population. Because you cannot rule out that this violence was probably inspired by envy, jealousy, and the rest of it. And the fact that the blacks, the miscreants who are involved in this, they certainly have, over the years, have felt that the South African government or the dismantling of the apartheid regime, that they have not benefited from it. And because it was, the apartheid system itself was maintained by violence, and the people themselves reacted with violence. And that mentality is still with them. So when they are confronted with the kind of situation they now find themselves, you know, the only way they know to react is through violent means. And Amarachi, you must also understand, as I've said a couple of times on this issue, you know, when you read Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, he was very clear that when the oppressed cannot go after the oppressor, it turns against itself. So you can see that the miscreants or those perpetuating this violence, they've left the main culprits, their government, those controlling the larger part of the economy that they cannot get at. So they begin to go after foreigners who live with them or who conduct business around their communities. These are the fellows they're attacking, you know, as a response to their own situation. So it is now left for the government of South Africa, not just to say enough is enough, but to take measures to address some of the critical issues that these fellows are complaining. Look, all of them are complaining about jobs. Yeah. They are actually saying that foreigners are taking their opportunities from them. But look, these foreigners, some of them came with resources to begin to do business in South Africa. They didn't get a loan from, even if they got a loan from the banks in South Africa, they are going to pay back. But the government of South Africa must do a lot to help its own people. It's only when they begin to do this and change the mindset of South Africans, you know, that's when I think that we can really begin to think of saying enough is enough. But as for now, I don't see that happening because the leadership of the ANC governments have failed, you know, to do this. And this is something they should have done immediately after the dismantling of the apartheid system.
Well, case in point is Nigeria also, in which we have had leaders who have not, you know, fulfilled promises over the years, and yet people are not reacting just as South Africans are. But as you said, of course, immigrants are also coming with their own resources, you know, to be able to live in the country. The South Africa Union has condemned the violence. Some African leaders also did not honor their invitation to the World Economic Forum for Africa in protest at the attacks. Yet the South African government says that countries like Nigeria, which also declined its attendance to the WEF, will lose out for boycotting WEF. What are your thoughts on this?
No, I think, first of all, in reaction to your initial comments on the fact that this is also, you know, part of our situation here in Nigeria. It's actually part of the situation in which, you know, Africans all over the continent find themselves. But one thing we must say about our own situation is that, look, most Nigerians today are not waiting or depending on the government to help them out of their situation. And that's where Nigeria is different from quite a number of Nigerians are different from quite a number of other Africans, you know. We are industrious, we are hardworking, we look for opportunities, we go for it and we work for it, and we also celebrate and rejoice a lot, or, show it off when we are successful, you know, and this is what makes the difference between Nigeria and the rest of the people of the continent. But yeah, look, the African Union has a lot to say or to do about this. Now that a number of African leaders have reacted the way they've done, it is time that this issue is put on the table at the next couple of meetings that the AU, you know, would have, because I don't think that South Africa can solve this problem alone, but I think that putting it on the table for discussion at AU meetings is a way of encouraging South Africa itself to look inwards and begin to see how they can help resolve this crisis, how they can help their own people, create opportunities for their own people. And the first thing they need to do is that they need to educate these characters on the streets of a number of these cities where these incidents are taking place. Because these are people who are basically, they are not educated, they cannot speak English if you listen to them the way they speak, and they are just angry that they have no opportunities, you know. And AU cannot do that, but the South African government is the one that can do that. But what AU can do is to help South Africa to realize that these killings have gone too far, and that the time has come for the South African government to do a lot more for its people in order to end the killings of foreigners. And the other thing, of course, is we have just signed the Continental Trade Agreement for this part of the world. And if it's to be successful, one critical element in the agreement is the free movement of goods and services. You know, so you cannot sign an agreement to allow people to move around and do business, and some bunch of characters are in one part of the continent killing others and shouting that they don't want foreigners, foreigners must leave, you know, their country. Look, that's just simply killing the agreement even before it formally takes off. So I sincerely hope that, as I said at the initial part of this interview, that the good thing about it is that everybody has realized that something needs to be done, not just the countries that are reacting, but even South African leaders, at least the rational ones, you know, are expressing their views that they really need to do something to arrest the situation.
Ambassador Joe Keshi, thank you again for speaking with us on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And as we end the program, having foreigners in a country is never a bad thing. It may seem like they take the only available jobs, are willing to work longer hours for little pay, but that's because as foreigners, they have more at stake and more to lose if they do not try to survive. And everyone is always trying to survive. The crime and criminality should be handled by the home country. But the human race is a leveler, and we all belong to it. Let's be kind to each other. I am Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.